The sun rose over the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944, illuminating what would become the site of the greatest aerial massacre in naval history. Japanese Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the mobile fleet with confidence bordering on arrogance. His 9 aircraft carriers held approximately 430 aircraft, the last significant concentration of Japanese naval air power. American Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded Task Force 58 with 15 carriers and more than 900 aircraft. But numbers alone don't tell the story. The Americans had radar. They had superior aircraft. They had the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, a fighter designed specifically to kill the Mitsubishi Zero. And they had pilots with hundreds of hours of training, while Japan's aviators were increasingly inexperienced replacements for the veterans lost at Midway, Coral Sea, and Guadalcanal. Most critically, the Americans had broken Japanese codes and knew the attack was coming. As Japanese planes began launching at dawn, American radar operators detected them while they were still 150 miles away. The carriers had time to launch their fighters, establish combat air patrol patterns, and prepare for what was about to unfold. One American pilot, looking at the radar screen showing hundreds of incoming contacts, said, "Hell, this is like an old-time turkey shoot." The name stuck. What the Japanese called a decisive battle would become known in American history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a slaughter so one-sided it would break Japanese naval aviation forever. At 8:30 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft, 69 planes, approached the American fleet. They flew in loose formations, many pilots so inexperienced they struggled to maintain position. American F-6F Hellcats climbed to meet them like wolves spotting a flock of sheep. The Hellcat was everything the Zero wasn't anymore. It was faster in a dive, more heavily armed with 6.50 caliber machine guns, and could absorb tremendous damage thanks to armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks. The Zero, once Japan's pride, was now obsolete, lightly built, lacking armor, with fuel tanks that turned into fireballs when hit. Commander David McCampbell, leading the American fighters, couldn't believe what he was seeing. Japanese pilots were making basic errors, flying in straight lines, failing to check their tails, breaking formation at the first sign of trouble. These weren't the skilled aviators who had attacked Pearl Harbor. These were barely trained replacements thrown into combat because Japan had no one else. The first wave was decimated in minutes. Of 69 Japanese aircraft, 42 were shot down before reaching the fleet. The remaining 27 pressed their attacks but faced a wall of anti-aircraft fire from American ships equipped with proximity-fused shells that exploded near aircraft without requiring direct hits. Only one Japanese bomb struck an American ship, causing minor damage. As the survivors limped back toward their carriers, American pilots pursued them, shooting down more. Of the 69 planes in the first wave, fewer than 30 returned. Japan's naval air arm was bleeding out, and the day had barely begun. At 9 a.m., while the first wave was being slaughtered, the second wave of 130 Japanese aircraft was already airborne and heading toward the American fleet. They had no idea what had just happened. Radio discipline and the chaos of combat meant no warning reached them. American radar picked them up 60 miles out. More F-6F Hellcats scrambled to intercept. The fighter direction officers aboard the carriers vectored their pilots with precision, using radar to position fighters for optimal interception. It was a technology and tactical advantage the Japanese couldn't match. Lieutenant Alexander Vrashu became the top scorer of the day. He spotted a formation of Japanese dive bombers at 15,000 feet and dove on them from above, the Hellcats' preferred attack profile. They looked like a flock of ducks, he later recalled. In 8 minutes, Vrashu shot down 6 Japanese aircraft. His gun camera footage would show plane after plane exploding, spinning, or simply disintegrating under his fire. He wasn't alone. Across the sky, American pilots were racking up kills with methodical efficiency. The second wave fared even worse than the first. Of 130 aircraft, 97 were shot down. The remaining 33 either turned back or were destroyed trying to attack through the wall of anti-aircraft fire. Japanese pilots reported hitting multiple American carriers, claims that were completely false. In reality, not a single American carrier was seriously damaged. As the remnants of the second wave retreated, American pilots were reporting ammunition shortages. They'd fired so much they were running low. The turkey shoot was exceeding all expectations. The third Japanese wave of 47 aircraft launched at 10 a.m. into a situation that was rapidly spiraling into catastrophe. These pilots received fragmented reports from survivors of the first two waves, reports that were either too optimistic or too horrifying to believe. Some claimed American carriers were burning. Others described apocalyptic scenes of Japanese planes falling from the sky like rain. The truth was somewhere in between, leaning heavily toward apocalyptic. This wave included some of Japan's remaining experienced pilots, men who had survived earlier battles and knew what they were doing. But experience alone couldn't overcome the technological and numerical disadvantage they faced. American radar guided fighters to intercept them 50 miles from the fleet. The resulting engagement was brutally one-sided. The Japanese formation broke apart almost immediately under the coordinated American attacks. Some pilots tried to fight, attempting the aerobatic maneuvers that had made the Zero famous. But the Hellcat pilots had been trained specifically to counter these tactics, never dogfight a Zero, use superior speed and firepower to boom and zoom, attack from altitude, and never get slow. Of the 47 aircraft in the third wave, 40 were destroyed. 7 managed to reach the American fleet, where they faced concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Several American ships reported shooting down the same planes. Everyone wanted credit. None of the 7 survived to return. By noon, the Japanese had launched 3 major waves, 246 aircraft total. Approximately 210 were destroyed. The scale of the disaster was becoming undeniable, even to Japanese commanders who desperately wanted to believe their pilots' exaggerated claims of success. At 11 a.m., Admiral Ozawa launched a fourth wave, 82 aircraft, the last reserves he could muster. By this point, American pilots were landing to refuel and rearm, quickly returning to the air to maintain combat air patrol. The American carriers had become efficient killing machines, cycling fighters through combat with brutal effectiveness. The fourth wave was supposed to coordinate with the survivors of earlier waves, creating a massed attack that would overwhelm American defenses. But there were almost no survivors to coordinate with, and the fourth wave's navigation was faulty. Many planes got lost, wandering the Philippine Sea searching for targets that were not where they expected. Those that found the American fleet encountered the same reception as their predecessors, radar-directed fighter interception followed by dense anti-aircraft fire. American pilots were describing the action in almost casual terms now. It's like shooting practice, one radioed to his carrier. They just keep coming straight at us. Lieutenant Commander Lawson, Red Ramage described intercepting a group of Japanese torpedo bombers. They were flying low and slow, perfect targets. We came in from their rear quarter and just picked them off one by one. I don't think they even saw us until it was too late. Of the 82 aircraft in the fourth wave, 73 were destroyed. The remaining 9 either turned back or were shot down attempting to return to their carriers. By early afternoon, the slaughter was complete. Japan had launched approximately 373 aircraft that morning. Fewer than 130 returned, and many of those were damaged beyond repair. The exact losses are still debated. Some historians put Japanese losses even higher, approaching 400 aircraft when including operational losses and accidents. While Japanese losses approached 400 aircraft, American losses were shockingly light. The official count, 29 aircraft lost in combat, with most pilots rescued by submarine or seaplane. Several more aircraft were damaged but recovered. The kill ratio was approximately 15-1 in favor of the Americans, one of the most lopsided aerial victories in military history. What made this disparity even more remarkable was that Americans had expected to take significant losses. Naval aviation was inherently dangerous, and the Japanese still had numerous carriers and aircraft. Admiral Mitcher had prepared for casualties in the hundreds. Instead, his force had achieved a near-perfect defensive victory. The reasons for this disparity were multiple and devastating to Japanese hopes. First, technology. American radar provided early warning and fighter direction that allowed efficient interception. Japanese carriers had no comparable system, operating effectively blind. Second, aircraft quality. The F-6F Hellcat was specifically designed to counter the Zero, with superior speed, firepower, and survivability. Japanese aircraft, while maneuverable, were fragile and increasingly obsolete. Third, pilot training. American aviators received 300+ hours of training before entering combat. By 1944, Japanese pilots were receiving as little as 100 hours, with minimal time in their actual combat aircraft. They were sent to die, not to fight. Fourth, doctrine. Americans had developed effective tactics through hard-won experience, while Japan clung to outdated dogfighting techniques that played to the Hellcat's strengths. Fifth, industrial capacity. America could replace losses easily. Japan could not. Every plane and pilot lost was irreplaceable. As the sun set on June 19, American pilots celebrated on their carriers. Japanese survivors faced the horrifying task of reporting what had happened. The aerial slaughter wasn't the only disaster Japan faced that day. While the air battle raged, American submarines were hunting Japanese carriers. The USS Albacore, commanded by James W. Blanchard, had been trailing the Japanese fleet for hours. At 8:09 a.m., while Japanese planes were launching for their doomed attacks, Albacore detected the fleet carrier Taiho, Japan's newest and largest carrier, commissioned just 3 months earlier. Blanchard maneuvered into attack position and fired 6 torpedoes. One hit Taiho's starboard side. The damage seemed minimal, the carrier remained operational and continued flight operations. But the torpedo had ruptured aviation fuel storage tanks, and vapors began spreading throughout the ship. A junior damage control officer made a fatal decision. He turned on the ventilation systems to clear the fumes, which instead spread them throughout the vessel. At 3:32 p.m., 7 hours after the torpedo hit, a catastrophic explosion tore through Taiho. The accumulated fuel vapors had found an ignition source. The blast was so powerful it blew the hangar deck upward, buckling the flight deck like cardboard. Within minutes, the newest carrier in the fleet was sinking. Admiral Ozawa escaped, but 1,650 crew members died. Meanwhile, the USS Kavala, commanded by Herman Kostler, had found another target, the fleet carrier Shokaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor. At 11:52 a.m., Kavala fired 6 torpedoes at close range. 3 or 4 hit, accounts vary. Shokaku, already carrying volatile aviation fuel and armed aircraft, turned into an inferno. At 3:01 p.m., she sank, taking 1,263 men with her. In a single day, Japan had lost not just 400 aircraft but 2 fleet carriers, 1 new, 1 veteran. The combined fleet was dying. American pilots returned from combat that day with stories that sounded like exaggerations but were simply facts. Lieutenant J.G. Wilbur Webb described his experience. I intercepted a group of Zeros at 18,000 feet. They tried to dogfight, which was their mistake. I extended away using my speed advantage, came back with altitude, and shot down 3 in about 4 minutes. They couldn't catch me, and they couldn't escape. It was like shooting crippled birds. Ensign William Butler, the Japanese pilot, seemed confused, disoriented. Some didn't even try to evade when I lined up on them. I shot down 2 that never saw me coming. A third saw me and tried to turn into my attack, but he was too slow. I walked my tracers right into his engine and he just exploded. It was almost too easy, and that made it sad in a way. Commander David McCampbell, who would become the Navy's top ace, shot down 9 enemy aircraft that day. Claims were later revised to 7 confirmed. He described the action as systematic execution. There was no challenge to it, he admitted. They flew like students, made every mistake in the book. Our training was superior, our aircraft were superior, and our tactics were superior. They never had a chance. But not all American pilots viewed the battle with satisfaction. Lieutenant Alex Vrashu, despite shooting down 6 planes, later reflected, "You could tell these weren't the skilled aviators Japan had at the war's start. These were kids, barely trained, sent to die. I felt more like a murderer than a warrior. But that's war, if we didn't kill them, they'd kill us." Still, it was a slaughter, not a battle. The Japanese pilots who survived and made it back to their carriers faced a scene of devastation and disbelief. Flight decks that had launched full squadrons now recovered only fragments of formations. Mechanics and deck crews waited for planes that would never return. Warrant Officer Seikyo Komatsu landed on the carrier Zuikaku with his aircraft riddled with bullet holes. He reported shooting down 2 American fighters, claims that were never verified and almost certainly false. But he also reported the truth: the sky was full of American fighters. For every plane of ours, there were 10 of theirs. They attacked in pairs, coordinated, professional. Our formations broke apart immediately. I saw planes falling everywhere, spinning, burning, exploding. I have never seen such slaughter. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, one of the few experienced pilots to survive the day, was more direct: "We were sent to die. The Americans knew we were coming. They were waiting with superior numbers, superior aircraft, and superior tactics. This was not a battle. This was an execution. We never had a chance." The psychological impact on survivors was devastating. These pilots had been raised on propaganda about Japanese superiority, about the invincibility of the Zero, about the cowardice of American pilots. Everything they believed had been proven false in the most violent way possible. Some pilots refused to believe their own reports. Others became fatalistic, accepting that Japan had already lost the war. A few continued to believe in eventual victory through willpower alone, but even they could see that hope was fading. As night fell and the final tallies came in, the scale of the disaster became undeniable. More than 300 aircraft gone. 2 carriers sunk. Hundreds of trained aviators dead. Japan's naval air arm had been broken in a single day. When initial reports reached Imperial headquarters in Tokyo, they were met with disbelief, then denial, then desperate attempts to find silver linings that didn't exist. Admiral Somu Toyota, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, initially received reports claiming Japanese pilots had sunk or damaged multiple American carriers. These reports were completely false, the product of over-optimistic pilot claims and wishful thinking. Some Japanese pilots, knowing they had failed, simply made up success stories. Others genuinely believed they had hit targets when they had not. In the chaos of combat, it was easy to mistake a near miss for a hit, or to claim credit for damage caused by someone else. The Japanese command structure had a cultural problem. Subordinates were reluctant to deliver bad news to superiors, and superiors were reluctant to believe reports that contradicted their expectations. This meant accurate information was filtered, delayed, or rejected. By June 20th, as survivors returned and real assessments were made, the truth could no longer be hidden. Admiral Ozawa reported losses exceeding 300 aircraft, though even this was an undercount. 2 carriers had been lost to submarines. American losses were minimal. The operation had been a catastrophic failure. But rather than acknowledge the defeat openly, Imperial headquarters began spinning narratives. The battle was described as a tactical setback rather than a strategic disaster. Pilot training problems were minimized. Equipment shortcomings were blamed on supply issues rather than industrial inadequacy. The propaganda machine went into overdrive, telling the Japanese public that the battle had been a draw or even a victory. Newspapers reported successful attacks against American carriers. Radio broadcasts celebrated brave pilots. The truth was buried. This denial at the highest levels prevented Japan from making necessary changes. If you don't admit you have a problem, you cannot fix it. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot wasn't just a battle, it was the culmination of Japan's failure to maintain a sustainable pilot training program. At the war's start, Japanese naval aviators were among the world's best, with years of experience and hundreds of hours of training. By mid-1944, that was a distant memory. Japan's training program had collapsed under the weight of wartime demands. The Navy had begun the war with approximately 3,500 trained carrier pilots. By June 1944, most were dead, killed at Midway, Guadalcanal, and in the grinding attrition of the Solomon Islands campaign. The replacements weren't ready. Where early war pilots received 300 to 700 hours of flight training over 2 to 3 years, mid-war replacements received 100 to 150 hours over a few months. Some pilots were sent to carriers with barely 100 hours total flight time, including training. Compare this to American pilots, who received 300+ hours before entering combat, with additional time in fleet training exercises. American pilots practiced gunnery, navigation, formation flying, and combat tactics extensively. They worked with experienced instructors who had survived combat and could teach real-world lessons. Japan had lost most of its experienced instructors. They were in combat units because Japan needed every available pilot. This meant the blind were leading the blind. Inexperienced instructors taught inadequate techniques to rushed students. Furthermore, Japan lacked training aircraft, fuel, and spare parts. Flight training was curtailed to conserve resources. Gunnery practice was minimal, ammunition was needed at the front. Navigation training was rushed, carriers needed pilots immediately. The results were predictable. Pilots arrived at their carriers unable to navigate effectively, unable to shoot accurately, unable to perform coordinated tactics, and unprepared for the psychological shock of combat. They were sent to die, and die they did. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat was designed with one purpose: kill the Mitsubishi A-6M0. Every aspect of its design was informed by captured Zeros and combat reports from pilots who had fought them. The result was a fighter that turned Japan's premier aircraft into an obsolete death trap. The Zero had been revolutionary in 1940, long range, excellent maneuverability, decent firepower. But these advantages came at a cost: no armor protection, no self-sealing fuel tanks, lightweight construction that couldn't absorb damage. In 1940, these trade-offs were acceptable. By 1944, they were fatal. The Hellcat was everything the Zero wasn't. It was heavy, armored, and built to absorb punishment. It had 6.50 caliber machine guns that could shred a Zero with a 1-second burst. It was faster in level flight and especially in dives, meaning Hellcat pilots could choose when to engage and when to disengage. Zero pilots couldn't. Most critically, the Hellcat matched the Zero's maneuverability at high speeds while being superior in every other performance category. American pilots were trained to exploit these advantages: never dogfight at low speeds where the Zero excelled, always attack from altitude with speed advantage, use boom and zoom tactics, and rely on teamwork. Japanese pilots still trained in pre-war dogfighting tactics that played to the Zero's strengths, but those tactics required getting Americans to dogfight, which they wouldn't do. The technological gap extended beyond fighters. American carriers had radar for early warning and fighter direction. Japanese carriers were blind until the enemy was visually spotted. American ships had proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells that exploded near targets. Japanese ships had conventional shells requiring direct hits. American damage control was sophisticated, with trained teams and effective equipment. Japanese damage control was less developed, as Taiho's loss demonstrated. In every measurable category, American technology was superior. Combined with better training and tactics, it created a killing field. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, the official name for the engagement that included the Turkey Shoot, was strategically decisive in a way that's difficult to overstate. In one day, Japan lost the ability to conduct offensive carrier operations for the remainder of the war. The mathematics were brutal. Japan began June 19 with approximately 430 carrier aircraft and trained crews. By June 20, fewer than 100 remained operational. The pilots killed couldn't be replaced, Japan's training pipeline couldn't produce qualified aviators fast enough. The aircraft destroyed couldn't be replaced, Japan's industrial capacity was overstretched. The carriers that survived, 7 of 9, were increasingly useless without aircraft and pilots. They would serve mainly as floating targets and decoys for the remainder of the war. Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet limped back to Okinawa, then to Japan proper, no longer a viable striking force. Compare this to American losses, 29 aircraft and most pilots rescued. Task Force 58 could replace all losses within days and actually increased in strength as the war continued. The strategic situation in the Pacific changed overnight. American forces could operate with impunity throughout the Philippine Sea and beyond. The liberation of the Philippines, planned for late 1944, would proceed without significant Japanese naval air opposition. The road to Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and eventually Japan itself was now open. Japanese military planners knew this. In private communications, senior officers admitted the war was lost. But publicly, the narrative remained one of eventual victory through sacrifice and spirit. The disconnect between reality and propaganda was becoming impossible to maintain, but maintain it they did. Japan would fight on for another 14 months, losing hundreds of thousands more lives in a war that was already decided on June 19, 1944. American frustration had been building throughout June 19. While they had won a stunning defensive victory, they hadn't been able to strike back at the Japanese carriers, the real prize. Admiral Mitcher wanted to destroy the enemy fleet, not just defend against it. On June 20, American search planes finally located the withdrawing Japanese fleet, but at extreme range, near the limit of American aircraft endurance. Launching a strike would mean aircraft returning after dark, a dangerous proposition. Many pilots would run out of fuel. Recovery operations at night were hazardous even under ideal conditions. Mitcher faced a decision: play it safe or go for the kill. He chose aggression. Launch M, he ordered. At 4:20 p.m. on June 20, 216 American aircraft launched toward the Japanese fleet, knowing many might not make it back. The strike force found the Japanese fleet at twilight and attacked immediately. The Americans sank the carrier Hyo and 2 oilers, damaged several other ships, and destroyed another 65 Japanese aircraft. It wasn't the total destruction Mitcher wanted, but it was devastating nonetheless. Then came the return flight, in darkness, with many aircraft running on fumes. Pilots began radioing that they were out of fuel. Some ditched in the ocean. Others circled desperately searching for their carriers. Mitcher made another bold decision: he ordered every ship in the fleet to turn on their lights, despite submarine threat, to guide the aircraft home. The fleet lit up like a city, searchlights pointing skyward, deck lights marking the carriers. Planes landed on any carrier that had space, abandoning the usual practice of only landing on your own ship. Some crashed on the deck. Some ditched alongside ships and were rescued. Some simply disappeared into the ocean. Of the 216 aircraft that launched, 20 were shot down by Japanese defenses. Another 80 were lost to fuel exhaustion or landing accidents. But most pilots were rescued. And the Japanese fleet had been hit again, decisively. Mitcher's gamble had worked. Behind the statistics were individual human stories, American and Japanese pilots whose lives intersected for brief, violent moments over the Philippine Sea. Lieutenant Alexander Vreshew's 6 kills on June 19 made him an ace in a single day. His gun camera footage became one of the most watched pieces of combat film in the Navy. But Vreshew later struggled with what he'd done, describing the Japanese pilots as kids who never had a chance. He said watching them die in such numbers affected him for years afterward. Ensign George Platts was shot down and survived in the water for 7 hours before being rescued by a submarine. He described watching the battle from the ocean. I could see planes falling all around me, mostly Japanese, but some American too. Each one represented someone like me, someone with a family, with dreams. War is abstract until you're floating in the ocean watching it happen all around you. On the Japanese side, Warrant Officer Seikyo Komatsu survived the Turkey shoot but was killed 2 months later in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. His last letter home, written after June 19, revealed his state of mind: "The Americans are too strong. We cannot defeat them. But I will do my duty until the end. Tell mother I tried my best." Ensign Kiyoshi Furuta, 19 years old, was one of the inexperienced pilots thrown into combat with minimal training. He was shot down within minutes of encountering American fighters and drowned when his parachute became tangled during water landing. His body was never recovered. His parents received notification 3 months later. Commander David McCampbell survived the war as the Navy's top ace with 34 kills. But he never celebrated the Turkey shoot. There was no honor in it. It was necessary, but it wasn't glorious. It was just slaughter. These individual stories remind us that statistics represent human lives ended, families destroyed, potential unfulfilled. American newspapers on June 21, 1944, exploded with triumphant headlines: "Japs lose 400 planes in one day, greatest air victory in naval history, Turkey shoot in Pacific." The American public, long frustrated by the slow pace of the Pacific War, celebrated the overwhelming victory. The coverage emphasized American technological superiority, pilot skill, and tactical excellence. Newsreels showed gun camera footage of Japanese planes exploding and falling. Radio broadcasts described the battle in dramatic terms. War correspondents wrote detailed accounts of the action. The Navy released pilot interviews and casualty figures. The message was clear: America was winning, decisively. In Japan, the coverage was starkly different. Initial reports claimed a great victory, with multiple American carriers sunk or damaged. Government-controlled newspapers ran headlines celebrating brave pilots and successful attacks. Photos of smiling aviators before the battle ran without mentioning how many had died. As the truth became harder to hide, the narrative shifted. The battle was described as a successful tactical withdrawal rather than a defeat. Losses were acknowledged but minimized. American advantages in numbers and equipment were emphasized to explain the outcome. The government blamed material shortages rather than strategic failures. By late June, the Japanese public was receiving a version of events that bore little resemblance to reality. Many suspected the truth, rumors spread through backdoor channels, and families who lost sons in the battle knew their sacrifices had achieved nothing. But publicly questioning official narratives was dangerous. The contrast between American openness and Japanese censorship highlighted the broader differences between the societies at war. America could admit setbacks and celebrate victories honestly. Japan could not afford truth because truth meant acknowledging the war was lost. Military analysts studying the Battle of the Philippine Sea identified multiple tactical failures that contributed to Japan's catastrophic losses. First, intelligence failure. Japanese commanders didn't know American carriers had radar-directed fighter control. This meant they planned for a battle Japan couldn't win, launching massed attacks that radar would detect and vector fighters to intercept. Second, coordination failure. The 4 Japanese attack waves were supposed to arrive simultaneously, overwhelming defenses. Instead, they arrived sequentially, allowing Americans to defeat them piecemeal. Navigation errors, timing mistakes, and communication failures prevented coordination. Third, altitude failure. Many Japanese aircraft attacked at medium altitudes, 10,000 to 15,000 feet, where American fighters had optimal performance advantages. Japanese aircraft should have attacked from high altitude, diving, or very low altitude, wave top, but neither tactic was employed effectively. Fourth, formation failure. Japanese formations broke apart under the first American attacks, eliminating mutual support. American fighters attacked in pairs and divisions, maintaining cohesion and mutual protection. Japanese pilots fought as individuals once formation was lost. Fifth, doctrine failure. Japanese tactical doctrine was outdated, based on pre-war assumptions that no longer applied. American doctrine had evolved through combat experience and was continually updated. Japan was fighting with 1941 tactics against 1944 opponents. Sixth, flexibility failure. When initial attacks failed, Japanese commanders had no backup plan. They continued launching waves into the meat grinder rather than adapting. American commanders constantly adjusted based on radar information and pilot reports. Seventh, technology failure. Beyond aircraft quality, Japanese carriers lacked radar, adequate anti-aircraft defenses, and effective damage control. They were fighting blind against opponents who could see everything. The combination of these failures turned what should have been a challenging battle into a systematic massacre. Every advantage went to the Americans, and they exploited those advantages ruthlessly. While fighter pilots received most of the glory for the Turkey shoot, American submarines played an equally crucial role in the Japanese defeat. The loss of 2 carriers to submarine attack was strategically as important as the aircraft losses. The USS Albacore's successful torpedo attack on Taiho was initially reported as a possible miss. The carrier had continued operations normally after being hit, suggesting minor damage. But Commander Blanchard's single torpedo had created a delayed action bomb. The ruptured fuel tanks and poor damage control decisions turned Taiho into a floating explosive. When she blew up 7 hours later, it validated the submarine's contribution. Blanchard received the Navy Cross. The USS Cavala's attack on Shokaku was more immediately devastating. Multiple torpedoes struck the veteran carrier, and she sank within hours. Commander Kostler's patience in stalking the fleet and waiting for the perfect shot had paid off. He also received the Navy Cross. Both submarines then had to escape. Japanese destroyers were hunting them with depth charges. Albacore went deep and silent, enduring hours of depth charge attacks before slipping away. Kavala successfully evaded and remained on patrol, later sinking a Japanese destroyer. The submarine campaign in the Pacific was perhaps the most successful aspect of the American naval war. Submarines sank more than half of all Japanese merchant tonnage, strangling the island nation's economy. They also sank numerous warships, including 8 aircraft carriers over the course of the war. But submarine warfare was dangerous. The U.S. lost 52 submarines and more than 3,500 submariners during the war, the highest casualty rate of any American military service. The silent service earned their title through both their operational secrecy and the silent sacrifice of those who never returned. The Turkey shoot would have been a victory regardless, but the submarine attacks turned a tactical triumph into a strategic disaster for Japan. In the weeks and months following the Turkey shoot, Japan's naval aviation never recovered. The losses were simply too severe, and the training pipeline too broken, to rebuild. By October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japan resorted to desperate measures that revealed just how broken their naval air arm had become, the kamikaze. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi proposed the tactic out of mathematical necessity. Japan no longer had enough skilled pilots to conduct conventional attacks with any hope of success. But a pilot with minimal training could fly an aircraft loaded with explosives into a ship, essentially turning the plane into a guided missile and the pilot into its guidance system. The first organized kamikaze attacks occurred during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, just 4 months after the Turkey shoot. These suicide attacks achieved some success, approximately 15 to 20% hit rate initially, because American defenses weren't prepared for pilots deliberately crashing into ships. But the kamikaze strategy was an admission of defeat. It meant Japan could no longer compete conventionally. It meant treating pilots as expendable ammunition rather than trained professionals. It meant accepting enormous losses for marginal gains. The kamikaze campaign would eventually involve approximately 3,800 pilots who deliberately crashed into Allied ships, sinking dozens and damaging hundreds more. But it couldn't change the war's outcome. For every ship sunk by kamikaze, America built 10 more. For every pilot who died deliberately, America trained replacements who survived. The Turkey shoot had broken Japan's naval aviation beyond repair. Everything that followed, the kamikaze, the desperate defense of Okinawa, the final months of the war, was aftermath. June 19, 1944, was the day Japan's naval air power died. The rest was just a prolonged death rattle. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot remains one of the most studied battles in military aviation history. Its lessons echo through every modern air campaign. Lesson 1: Quality matters more than quantity. Japan had hundreds of aircraft, but poorly trained pilots in obsolete planes. America had fewer aircraft at the start of the battle but superior pilots and technology. Quality won decisively. Lesson 2: Intelligence and information dominance are decisive. American radar provided situational awareness that allowed optimal defensive positioning. Japan operated blind. Information advantage turned into tactical advantage. Lesson 3: Training is irreplaceable. Japan's failure to maintain a sustainable pilot training program cost them the war. Once the experienced pilots were lost, no amount of courage or spirit could compensate for inadequate training. Modern air forces learned this lesson: pilot training is never compromised, no matter the cost. Lesson 4: Technology must evolve with battlefield conditions. The Zero was excellent for 1940 but obsolete by 1944. Japan couldn't or wouldn't adapt. America continuously improved its aircraft based on combat experience. Lesson 5: Industrial capacity determines staying power. America could afford to lose aircraft and pilots because they could be replaced quickly. Japan couldn't. Industrial warfare requires industrial strength. Lesson 6: Tactical flexibility and adaptation are essential. American doctrine evolved constantly. Japanese doctrine remained static. Rigid thinking leads to predictable outcomes, and predictable opponents are easily defeated. Today, the battle site in the Philippine Sea is quiet. The aircraft and most of the men who fought there are long gone. But the lessons remain. Every modern fighter pilot studies the Turkey Shoot. Every naval aviator learns the tactics that worked and those that failed. Every military planner understands the strategic implications of losing 400 aircraft in a single day. It was the day the sky fell on Japan, and the day America proved that dominance in the air would decide the Pacific War.